Good evening, and again, welcome to our midweek Bible study as we continue through the Gospel of Mark. And turn in your copy of Scripture to Mark chapter 8. While you're turning there, can I just say what a blessing you are to my family. You have been so gracious to us, and we're thankful for every moment of celebration that we've experienced, your warmth and your kindness and your love. The reality is that no pastor can serve at a church over a long haul unless that church is a participant in that journey. Being 20 years at First Norfolk has been a great privilege of my life and our family, and that's because of you. So thank you for being the church that allows me to serve as pastor for these past 20 years. And again, you have been gracious and overwhelming in your kindness and your love, and beyond measure, beyond what I deserve. And so thank you for that. Mark chapter 8. Now, last midweek, we looked at Jesus reaching out to the unreachable, those who seem to be beyond the reach. And the good news is that Jesus, with the coming of Jesus, yes, it may be the power of the gospel to the Jew first, but it's also to the Gentile, and that's you and me. There is good news for the stranger and the foreigner to the covenant, to the commonwealth of Israel, and stranger to the covenant of promise. There's hope in Jesus because we who once were far off have been brought near by the death of Christ on a cross. And we share that good news, the good news that Jesus does all things well. You need some good in your life, you get to Jesus. Immediately following that, so Jesus was in the region of Tyre, and then he goes through the 10 cities of the Decapolis. And now, I believe he stays in those cities of Decapolis. Mark chapter 8, we're going to look at verses 1 through 10, and it's going to sound familiar for those who have been on this study with us together. In those days, Mark chapter 8, verse 1, in those days, the multitude being very great, having nothing to eat. Now, in those days, I believe, points back to Jesus in the region of Decapolis, verse 31. Mark chapter 7, verse 31. Again, departing from the region of Tyre and Sidon, Jesus came through the midst of the region of Decapolis to the Sea of Galilee. All right? So I believe chapter 7, verse 31 gives us clue as what chapter 8, verse 1, in those days. While he's making this circuitous journey from Tyre and Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in those days. The multitude, now these are primarily Gentile people. If my interpretation is correct, he's still in the Decapolis, around Tyre and Sidon. He's still making his way back to the Sea of Galilee. In those days, a multitude followed him. So they're primarily Gentiles following him. Very great. The multitude being very great, having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to himself, and he said to them, verse 2, I have compassion on the multitude because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their own houses, they will faint on their way, for some of them have come from afar. And his disciples answered him, how can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? And he said, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. So he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground. He took the 7 loaves and gave thanks, broke them and gave to his disciples to set before them. And they set them before the multitude. And they also had a few small fish. And having blessed them, Jesus said to set those fish before the crowd. Verse 8, so they ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. And those who had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away, immediately got into a boat with the disciples and came to the region of Dalmanutha. Does that sound familiar? It should, because just in chapter 6, Mark chapter 6, Jesus has fed 5,000 people. And you might say, well, is this the same event? No. Is this a retelling of what happened in Mark 6? No, it's a different, distinct moment in time, a different, distinct historical moment in the ministry and life of Jesus. It is in a different location where Mark chapter 6 takes place primarily around Bethsaida, primarily with Jewish people, if not exclusively with Jewish people. Mark chapter 8 takes place around in the region of the 10 cities, which is primarily Gentile. So you have, in my interpretation, you have Mark chapter 6, a feeding for the Jewish people. Mark chapter 8, a feeding for Gentile people. Remember what he's done. He has already, in the area of Tyre, healed the daughter of a Gentile woman. And he has offered her the crumbs, if not the whole loaf of bread of God's blessing found in Jesus, the Son of God. He's done what only God can do, and he's provided that for the Gentiles. He's begun to cross the barrier, the divide between Jew and Gentile. And even though the gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, it's also to the Gentile. And we're thankful that even though we once were strangers to the covenant promise and aliens, foreigners to the commonwealth of Israel, living without God and without hope in our world, even then, we who were once far off have been brought near to God through the sacrifice of Jesus and through the grace that God pours on us when we place our faith in Jesus. Gentiles have been grafted in to the family of God through faith in Jesus Christ. So now we see Jesus ministering what I believe, to whom I believe primarily a Gentile audience that were drawn to Jesus. They were gathered around Jesus. They were following Jesus. And so just as Jesus had compassion on the Jewish people, the members of the treasured possession of God, children of Israel, Jesus also has compassion on Gentiles made in the image of God. As we look at this story, I want us to remember first that we see the compassion of Jesus. We see an encounter between Jesus and people in need, and he responds to their need with compassion. He says in verse 2, I have compassion on the multitude. That compassion was personal. That compassion was specific. That compassion was practical. It was personal. I have compassion on you, the multitude. It was practical. They have been with me 3 days. They don't have anything to eat. It was heartfelt. It was deep. If I sent them away hungry, they could faint on the way home, and it could be hurtful to them. It was a compassion that was emotive, and they're a long way from home. Jesus cared about these people. Jesus cares about you and me. If ever there was doubt that Jesus cares for you, you need to read this story. These are a people that every other Jewish teacher would say they are outside the bounds of God's grace and love and mercy and help. But not Jesus. God himself has come to show compassion on people just like you and just like me. For us, we sometimes feel like I've been too bad to receive the help that Jesus offers. Jesus was wanting to help all the crowd, not just a few. Just think about this. Everybody in that crowd was not living a perfect, God-fearing, God-seeking life. Most of them, many of them, if not most of them, were people that were far from God in every possible way. They weren't living by Judeo ethic. They weren't living by Christian ethic. They were living by a Hellenistic ethic, which included all kinds of behavior. And yet, regardless of where they had been, regardless of their status in ethnicity or past behavior or even current belief structure, Jesus cared. And Jesus cares. He cares for you. He cares for me. The moments where I know the compassion of Jesus most fully as a follower of Jesus is when I have been most disobedient to God himself. And yet he has shown me compassion. You might think I don't have any grounds upon which to ask Jesus for help and think that he would care about me. I've got to tell you, the ground of that is not based upon you, it's based upon him. The reason Jesus cares is not because we deserve it or even earn it. Jesus cares because that's who he is. It is an echo of John 3:16, for God so loved the world, the cosmos, a world of unbelieving people. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. It's Romans 5:8 that while we were still sinners, hostile toward God, Jesus died for us. This is his care. He doesn't just care for righteous people or those who approximate righteousness. Jesus cares for the wicked and the sinner. So today, we need to see that Jesus cares. Secondly, not only do we see Jesus cares, but we see the compassion of Jesus, but also we need to see the provision of Jesus. I have a granddaughter. Her name is Lucy, and Lucy is about 3 months old. When she has a need, she lets you know. I mean, she's 3 years old. She's not subtle about it. She fills up her lungs and she begins to wail. And she wails until that need is met, whatever that need might be. And she might not even be able to identify the need specifically, but she knows that there is something not the way it needs to be. She's not comfortable. She needs help. And so she cries out until that need is help. And we don't just sit there. When we hear her crying, we move. Her mama moves. Her grandmommy moves. Her big sister Nora moves. Her daddy moves. Her poppy moves to help. We'll do whatever, and we'll team up to help because we don't want her to continue in need. We want to provide for that need. When Jesus hears us crying out in our need, he doesn't just sit there and say, okay, but rather he moves to help. Look at verses 4 through 10. The disciples said, how can we satisfy all this need? And Jesus says, you can't. Didn't you learn anything before in Mark chapter 6? You can't do it by yourself, but I can. Jesus is the maker of heaven and earth. Jesus is the Lord who gave manna to the children of Israel in the desert wilderness wanderings. This is Jesus who fed 5,000 people just a few weeks before, and this is Jesus who has a loaf of bread and some fish, and he is ready to do that creative work, and he provides. And he provides in such a way that the baskets are filled, and the baskets are full, and there are fragments left over. Where the disciples can't satisfy the people, Jesus satisfies completely. When we think about how Jesus operates in our world today, we need to understand that he sees us in our need. No one's beyond the reach of his love and his compassion. And when we cry out to him and we depend upon him, make no mistake, he will satisfy us so completely that there is abundance flowing over. Just as we learned from the story of the Syrophoenician woman and the deaf-mute man who was healed, the people go around saying he has done all things well. Even now, you need to know that if you need something good in your life, you need to get to Jesus because Jesus and Jesus alone can satisfy your soul. Yeah, he feeds 4,000 and they are all satisfied. I pray that you and I would experience the kind of satisfaction that Jesus offers, the kind of satisfaction that sinks down into the depths of our soul, not because we've earned it, not because we deserve it, but because Jesus has provided for us and we've received that provision by faith. You want to be satisfied? Get to the one who does all things well. Let's get to Jesus. Now, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing that you may abound in hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. God bless you all. Good night.